Hey guys. So I haven't been live on Facebook here in a while, and I thought, and I'm going to post this to YouTube later, but I thought I'd go live on Facebook since it's been a while. And I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about today um, is a new development. It's a new development, but an old development. So I posted an article earlier today uh, about a conservative Canadian talk show news radio guy named Stefan Molyneux. He's a podcaster. And I was riding in the car with a colleague of mine the other day, and I heard his most recent podcast, which I posted here on my Facebook page today, that discussed a fight or a Twitter war or something of that nature that he was having with Nassim Taleb. And it was all about the concept of IQ. And as some of you might know, or will learn now, one of the things that seemed to continually come up for Stefan on his show is the concept of race and IQ, which in academia is basically a no-no nowadays. I've spoken with colleagues about this concept, and it's basically a no-go zone. So you don't speak about race and IQ anymore. And Stefan did yet another podcast yesterday in response to the Twitter fight he was having with Nassim Taleb about race and IQ. For what reason, I don't know. But mostly it was just IQ and how valid the concept is. And Nassim apparently wrote some article, a very short article, on how basically IQ is a fake concept, or it's a concept that's kind of pseudoscientific in its nature, and it shouldn't be given much credence anymore because it basically creates slaves to a degree, and it creates kind of mindless paper pusher kind of people, which is not how humans are designed to be, essentially, which makes kind of sense on the surface. And people like Stefan and others, Douglas Murray and whatnot, are big proponents of the measure of IQ. And Stefan launched in this 51-minute podcast that said a lot of, he did a good job, it seemed like, of rebutting different arguments by Nassim. But there's something that's interesting, and something I've heard from Stefan a number of times now that I've had the luxury of listening to him a few times, is he continues to trot out statistics about different cultures, different races and ethnicities, and their different average IQs as a group. And he seems to do it very nonchalantly, which, just speaking as a person and as a professional, because of the environment that we live in nowadays, I have such a strong kind of I had to chuckle out loud when I heard him talking about the different races and IQs, African Americans in the United States having an average IQ of 85, etc. This kind of stuff. And what else did he say in the podcast yesterday? He said something like, one of the reasons that people in Muslim countries have a lower IQ is because the religion of Islam allows for cousin marriage, and that will, on average, inbreeding at the cousin level, first cousin level, will lower your IQ by 10 points on average. So he said things like that, which made me chuckle out loud and kind of nervously laugh and kind of rub my face as I'm doing right now, because it's like these concepts, although we have agreed in psychology for a long time that IQ is basically a valid concept that measures some basic intellectual qualities that might be useful across a number of jobs and a number of, let's say, life pursuits, whether it's the military, certain kinds of work, etc. More and more people have been criticizing the concept for the last 30 years, and it's become kind of this no-no thing to talk about because it was something that was used in kind of the eugenics movement in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And although that did happen, as Stefan points out, it did happen. It's not to say that everyone who's interested in it is some kind of eugenicist. And I get that argument that Stefan makes, but I find myself mostly just confused. Now, I don't know exactly all the context. I'm here looking at Nassim Taleb's Twitter right now, and there are just an endless number of tweets about IQ. He says stuff like, I'm looking at it right now at 10:33 p.m. here in California on Saturday, January 5th, and he said something 7 hours ago that national average IQ is BS. And he made a number of statements over the last basically day and a half defending himself to regular people and psychologists and everyone, like basically saying that it's not a useful concept. And I don't know why. Like here's the thing that I'm going live about and I'm confused about, and I would love as many responses as possible because I don't get what the fight's about. I don't get what the disagreement is about between the two of them. So on the one hand, Nassim's point about the fact that IQ is not a perfect construct and the fact that it correlates somewhat strongly and somewhat not so strongly with a bunch of important life domains, again, makes sense. Stefan's point that there's something important about a person's intelligence and how they fit into a world, into a culture, also makes sense. So the fight, to me, it seems like the two of them are speaking past each other in some ways. The other thing that sticks out to me is it seemed that from what I could recall of what Stefan said in his podcast and from what I could see on Nassim's Twitter feed, that there was this really weird moment where I think Nassim Taleb made some kind of comment that basically G is not a useful concept. General intelligence is not a useful concept. And again, I will say that I am not at all any kind of expert in psychometrics and or intelligence testing. Cognitive testing is definitely not my deal. I am a clinical psychologist by training and by trade, and in my experiences doing any kind of research and teaching, I'm not a psychometrician. But once I heard this podcast, and once I started looking through the tweets that were basically very kind of juvenile on both ends, it seemed to me that maybe there was a way to figure out how useful maybe a concept like G is. And I read a great article that anyone can Google Scholar if they're interested. It's by two authors named Kovacs, Kovacs, and Conway. It was published in 2016 in the Journal of Psychological Inquiry. And the title of the journal article, if anyone is interested, is called Process Overlap Theory, a unified account of the general factor of intelligence. And they go through a fairly sound argument that basically says G is a good concept because of all the both verbal and nonverbal tests that we have that measure intelligence. The majority of them basically will come up with some kind of G score because they're assessing for these overlapping areas of intellectual and neurochemical functioning, and these brain areas that light up pretty consistently across these intellectual domains, these tasks, these memory tasks, these reasoning tasks, these spatial ability tasks, overlap in such a way that it makes sense that there's a general amount of intelligence that can be assessed for using these standard cognitive tests. Working memory, for instance, is a big deal in most versions of what people call intelligence. And the neat thing is that, a lot of these tests that have a kind of a G loading will account for something like 40% of the variance in intelligence. Now, the problem, there was a critique in that same issue by a gentleman named Ackerman, same issue, 2016, same journal, is that basically if it only accounts for 40% of the variance, then is it really a reasonable way to assess for intelligence overall? That's a fair point. However, we don't have anything much better at this point. Like EQ, emotional intelligence, is also extremely important for your ability to survive and thrive. And as Stefan Molyneux pointed out in his podcast, having a very, very high IQ does not mean you have life success. Having a very high IQ can even be limiting in many ways, which is why most people don't go above 140, 150, etc. And people who do tend to live very, very unique and sometimes very troubled lives. So this debate about IQ, I don't understand in the first place. I mean, I hear both of their arguments. I hear Stefan's worry about, intermixing people in such a way that maybe bad things happen to cultures as a whole. And I hear that Nassim is saying it's kind of a construct that has fewer real world or ecological validity kind of points of connection, So I get that. I get the ecological validity argument, and I get the argument from Stefan that says we also need to make sure that people are similar enough that the culture can survive. Now, the question for me is, why are we arguing about this? Because I don't think you're going to find that, to Stefan's point, I don't think you're going to find that the people at the immigration system in the United States, I don't think they're going to start giving out a WISC, which is a kid's intelligence test, or a KABC, Kaufman, or they're going to be giving out a WACE to adults. They're going to give these tests out to kids to assess them, to see if they should be immigrants or if they should be naturalized citizens. I don't find that to be a very logical thing that's going to happen. I don't think they're going to pay a psychologist, some kind of psychologist, whether it's an educational psychologist or a clinical psychologist, to come out and give these intelligence tests. I don't think you're going to see that happen. And although I can see why it might be nice to have some kind of well thought out version of how much heterogeneity in IQ is good for a culture, I don't necessarily know that that's ever going to be achievable or feasible, just from the pure logistics of the problem. And then to Nassim's point, I don't quite get the worry about using a test that basically is useful, even though it doesn't have ecological validity like you would like, and despite some of the psychometric issues that he points out in his just cascading, never-ending tweets here today. And again, there's all sorts of statistical things going on here, and he just is making a number of tweets January 4th through January 5th here, getting angry at Stefan and others and trying to respond somewhat reasonably. I just don't get the big deal why it matters at all. I just don't quite understand why it doesn't matter. I mean, if let's just say let's say if everything that's saying is that Nassim is saying is correct. Let's say that IQ is such a bad measure of intelligence, and it's so culturally loaded, and it's so biased, and it's so poorly thought out for how people currently work. Let's just say that that's the case. If that's the case, then what I would be curious about is what is a better place, what is a better concept, what's a better place to research, and what is a better concept to research in order to assess for how people are functioning, because EQ is a big deal. You can go hang out with people like Daniel Goleman and read their research on emotional intelligence, and that's a concept that's kind of running through the treatment industry, and it's running through the business industry, the business world, the business consulting world all the time. But what measures of intellectual capacity are more appropriate than the IQ test would be my open-ended question. I don't have an answer. Again, I'm not a psychometrician. I have an understanding of the basic batteries that exist. I understand Ravens. I understand the Kaufman batteries. I understand the WACE and the WISC because I was trained on them. I understand the DCAFs. I understand a lot of neurocognitive measures. But I just don't get what the big deal is. I don't get why they're fighting. I think they're speaking at cross purposes, and I just don't see the utility in that. I also don't know what the utility is in continuing an argument that is kind of profit motivated. So like, it seems like both players have some kind of motivation for selling books or bringing attention to their podcasts and stuff. And Nassim rightly points out that a lot of psychometricians and psychologists are invested in keeping their tests alive because, again, it makes them money and allows them to keep their career going. However, I think when Nassim says something like in his article that basically it's a bunch of hucksters who want to fool people and indoctrinate people and make them kind of lazy paper pushers or mindless paper pushers, I find that so hard to believe, because with the advent of the IQ test, we've been able to structure society more efficiently. I mean, if you look at the way the United States and other countries were structured in terms of their educational systems and other things like that, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, things dramatically changed with the advent of the intelligence test. Obviously, it was used more for military purposes at the time, but still, we were able to kind of better allocate who was good at what thanks to these tests. And I don't think all of that utility is just magically gone. Now, personally speaking, or I guess professionally speaking, I think IQ tests are somewhat interesting and somewhat useful. However, what's more important is what your personality is and how you score on standardized measures of personality, whether that's the MMPI, the MCMI, or the Big Five. And if I were to use a quick and dirty test that gives you really good results across a number of domains, it would be the Big Five, because it's predictive of a lot of different life variables, outcome variables. So I think maybe we're having the wrong conversation. Maybe it's just, why don't we talk more about personality? Why don't you all jump on the kind of the Jordan Peterson bandwagon and start talking more about the Big Five, or pick your personality test and talk about how those personality traits correlate with different areas of life success and fulfillment. And like, I just read a study today because I'm developing a lecture for an adolescent therapy class that showed that pro-social behavior was highly correlated with trait agreeableness from the Big Five personality test. And there's a cultural influence there, but because agreeableness is predominantly a genetically loaded trait, and it's a gender loaded trait, it's going to be kind of a very straightforward way of looking at who's going to maybe be more pro-social and how to predict and intervene on people who are less pro-social. So like, if you know kids score lower on measures of agreeableness, you might have to work on social skills training with them. That might be a lot more advantageous than going, okay, Johnny has a score of 95 on his IQ test, so we need to worry about whether he's going to be some kind of advanced level, maybe possible manager, or maybe he'll be some kind of tradesman. We don't know what he'll be, right? Maybe that discussion is more important about agreeableness and pro-social behavior and things of that nature than it is about IQ, working status, and income. Because that seems to be kind of the gist of the discussion on Twitter, from what I can tell from Nassim's Twitter, is there's this very, very, very strong correlation, or these people are trying to convince him of the strong correlation between IQ and income, which he says is not the same thing as amount of wealth. So again, there's all these different kind of spinning plates in the air, and I just don't get the necessity to keep them spinning. That's really where I'm at. I've been watching kind of on the outskirts for the last 6 months. For the last 6 months, I've been trying to follow the race and IQ debate, because there are a couple of podcasts with Sam where that didn't go so well with Ezra Klein. There's been all this going on with Stefan for years. Stefan's been living on the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate watch list forever, I guess, because he's been talking about race and IQ for a long time. And he's been kind of unabashedly saying the statistics that I guess are true according to his 18 experts in IQ tests. And I don't see the necessity of talking about it anymore. I can understand wanting to talk about immigration. I can understand wanting to talk about how to better predict who's going to have life success better than IQ. And I think, again, you take Jordan Peterson's route, you talk about big five personality traits, conscientiousness, agreeableness, etc. You're going to have a much more interesting conversation on your hands. However, we're not there. We are still arguing about concepts pretty incessantly, it seems like. Like, we can't let it go. So I'll put it to you guys. Anyone who watches this, anyone who maybe has a better understanding of the IQ debate, maybe someone who's followed the Twitter war between Stefan and anyone else about IQ, and then Nassim. I mean, Nassim is whipping out the graphs and everything. Here's a tweet 6 hours ago that says, even when there is a correlation between IQ and performance, it is swamped by noise. Swamped is in all capital letters. Is it me, or that psychologists have no notion of noise? So basically he's saying that psychologists are idiots who don't understand the statistical concept of noise, when in reality, psychologists probably use these kind of statistical analyses more than most other professions, because we have to look at just huge sums of data and plot them on scatter plots and other kinds of plots and figure out, like, okay, there were 1,000 people who took this measure, and how did the 1,000 do on this one trait, etc. Like, we really have to know. So psychologists use these ideas the most. So he's being a little passive aggressive when he says, is it me, or that psychologists have no notion of noise? It's like, okay, so a lot of psychologists are probably not up on the IQ literature. I, for one, will say that I am not up on the IQ literature. As of January 5th, 2019, I have not read many articles in the last year even on IQ. When I was in grad school, I read a lot more, but I have not. I mean, I still am a fan of the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of intellectual abilities, but that still seems to be one of the more modern ways of looking at things. But outside of that, I'm kind of disconnected, and I doubt many of my colleagues who are in clinical practice, who are psychologists, who are just doing therapy, have read a lick of IQ research in a long time. So to kind of lambaste psychologists based upon the few who are talking about it, it's kind of like, why are you picking on the crippled guy? That doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it's like, of course they're not looking at it. Many people don't look at research. Most people, when they get licensed, never look at research again. The fact that there are a few of us who do, who are either in academia or work for consulting businesses or whatever, is kind of a rarity. So I don't get why Nassim has to be so disagreeable and kind of rude, and I don't get why Stefan is just obsessed about this. That's kind of where I'm at. So for any of you who are interested, definitely check out Stefan's podcast. He says some very racy sounding things about race and IQ. I mentioned a couple of them earlier. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to spit some thoughts out there. And for anyone who is really interested in the kind of culture war that's going on, the us versus them war, the you're a different color than me war, the SJW versus conservative war versus common sense versus not common sense war. This has been a big deal for a long time now, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon. But there's a lot of rubbish that's being talked about, and I think this is becoming rubbish. I think this is readily going from an academic, like, kind of egalitarian, thoughtful discussion is turning into a, like, what I'm reminded of is the show Celebrity Deathmatch. It's like Nassim Taleb is going to be a claymation figure, and he's going to fight Stefan Molyneux as a claymation figure, and there's going to be announcers, and it's going to be, let's get ready to rumble, and we're fighting for no good reason, but just for entertainment value. I don't even know that there's an actual substantive disagreement that's worth having at this point. But I could be wrong, and I, again, am not an expert in any of this stuff. I found one theory that might promote, YG is a good concept. Other than that, like, why don't we worry about bigger fish? Why don't we worry about the opioid epidemic? Or why don't we worry about, I don't know, violence in the United States? Why don't we worry about the fact that there are a bunch of kids who don't eat in this country, even though we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world? I mean, poverty, drug abuse, malnutrition, obesity. Those are four big concepts that obviously have very deep philosophical and political issues and psychological issues at hand that are keeping them alive. These seem like much more important things to discuss than is IQ the most perfectly valid concept. But I could be wrong. Maybe I'm not seeing what Nassim is seeing, or maybe I'm not seeing what Stefan is seeing. I think they're just picking a fight because they're interested in being right, which that's academia for you, but it's such a waste of time. It really, really is. So anyways, I just wanted to ramble for a while. I appreciate all of you who are kind of out and saying hello. It looks like one person said hello. Hello, Jerome. And I will see you all tomorrow, right around noon Pacific Standard Time. And I will do the 7th episode, the 7th installment of the HTTP series. So come check that out, please. Definitely check out the fear problem. I think this literally addresses what I'm talking about here. These two fighting for basically no good reason. Two seemingly smart people who are arguing about IQ and how valid a concept it is and how racist a concept it is and how useless a concept it is. I mean, it's just, I think they are arguing for basically no good emotional reasons. And it's kind of tiring. It's kind of tiring to hear. It's kind of boring. I mean, it's funny. Like I got a number of, you can ask if you ever get a chance to meet my colleague, if you ever, I interviewed him, Dr. Scale, but if you ever get a chance to meet the people who know me, they'll know that I laugh at this kind of stuff because some of the things that are said in these kinds of podcasts are kind of hilarious and outlandish sounding. If only we could just get along a little bit better, just a little bit better. I know it's impossible to get along, but just get along a little bit better. Maybe we could accomplish a little bit more. If we fought less, maybe we would get along just a little bit more. I mean, maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't. Anyways, see you all tomorrow, 12 o'clock on YouTube, live, HTTP, episode 7. And I guess I hope you all have a very good night and talk to you soon.